This is seaming with mattress stitch, also known as invisible stitch. You start with your two pieces with the right sides facing, just right next to each other. At the beginning, I like to do a figure 8 to join them really nicely. I'm going to use a contrast color yarn to sew so that you can see it a little bit more clearly. So to start with, I'm going to go on one of these pieces going from the wrong side to the right side, one stitch from the edge. So you can see there's one V here on the edge, then right in the corner of my cast on row. Pull that through, leave a little tail to weave in later on. Then I do the same thing on the other piece. Again, wrong side to right side, just underneath one stitch from the edge. Pull that through and come back to the first side, exact same place, same direction, everything I did before, so always from the wrong side to the right side, creating my figure 8 here. So it's never a perfect figure 8. There you go, figure 8 or infinity symbol. When I pull that tight, it's going to lock this into place and really be nicely aligned at the bottom edge, and also mean that my yarn tail can't get pulled right through, so I can really yank, which you'll see I need to do. Now to start sewing, my yarn's attached on the left, so I'm going to go to the piece on the right. I'm going to put my needle in where it last went out and scoop up one of these little bars. You can't really see it till you've got it, but it's right in between the stitches that you do see. But if you put your needle in where you came out and keep your needle parallel to the edge, it will appear. So you might have to have just a little bit of trust. I like to leave this a little loose because that makes it much easier to see where I came out. Needle parallel to the edge. Now I'm using a bent tip needle and I have it curved upwards, which makes it a little easier to scoop up those bars. What you're catching is actually the bump that makes the purl side look bumpy, but you're catching it from the knit side where it's not terribly visible. Now, in many cases, you'll have two pieces that are exactly the same, but if you ever have a piece where you have a couple more rows on one side than the other, the way to deal with that would be to take two bars on one side. So I'll show you how that looks over here. So I'm going to go in and take here, I've got two bars on my needle, not just one. Now every inch or so, which is about where I am, you want to pull it tight. And I'm going to pull pretty much all of this sewing yarn out. So what you can see here as a big loose zigzag is going to be a straight taut line. So I'm going to hold it here and just pull and pull and pull, and just zips right up so that you can't really see the seam at all. You can't see that nice bright color yarn that I'm working with. And on the inside it gives you a little bit of seam allowance, so some of the edge folds into the inside. So it's a very sturdy seam and quite sneaky. Then to start up again, I would just open it up a bit so I can see where I came out and continue onward from there. So this is how I do it when I'm sewing the edges of rows to rows, like a side seam or a sleeve inseam. I'm going to show you as well what I would do if I was sewing stitches to stitches, which would be two cast on edges or bound off edges together. So I'm just going to make a crazy little piece putting together all my swatches. This is multiple swatches for a project. But I was just not getting gauge, but I thought it'd be perfect for this. So here I've got my bound off edges together, and I'm going to start with that figure 8 again. Now if your yarn is already attached, if I was going to sew with this yarn, I would skip step 1 because it's already on there, but since it isn't, I'm going to start with step 1. So wrong side to right side, right in that corner, one stitch from the edge, one row from the edge. Same thing over here. And something that might have made my life easier if I thought about it would be to weave in this yarn tail before I got started, just so it's out of my way. Generally what I do when I know I'm going to seam something is I'll leave a long yarn tail anytime I have to add new yarn and use those tails to seam so I don't have to add on extra. So here is my little figure 8. I'm going to pull that nice and snug. And the feeling of this seam is similar, but I'm going to be working into a different direction of my piece. So I'm going to go in where I came out, stay parallel to the edge, and I'm going to catch a V. Now I have two choices. I could catch this V right here, which is quite visible, easy to see. That gives me quite a large seam allowance because this is the row before I bound off, and the whole bound off row gets turned to the inside. If I want to be sneaky and have a smaller seam allowance, I can catch the V right above that, which is a little hard to see. It looks more like just two parallel lines than a V. Catch that again for you. There it is. It is small and tight, but a lot less fabric gets turned to the inside. So if you can find it, I think it's a better way to go. And then like before, my repeat is going to be that I go in where I came out and keep my needle parallel to the edge. And again here, this is the nice easy to see V. If that's what you can find, it's okay to use. But I like to sneak up here and catch the V that's actually part of my bind off row, because I'll have a smaller seam allowance. And like before, I'm going to leave this a little loose until I've gone about 1 inch or so. I'm trying not to spear my yarn, but just to scoop it, and that's why having a needle that is blunt is very helpful. And once I've gone, 1 inch or so, with some yarns you might be able to go a little farther, with some you might need to do it a little sooner, just depending on how grabby they are. Then I'm going to zip this up. So I'm just going to pull, pull, pull till all of my sewing yarn has disappeared. You might need to really yank on it. This particular one, I think I might have split the yarn accidentally because I am yanking a bit more than usual. But it should zip up tight so that you don't see your sewing yarn at all, even if it's a different color. See a little blip of it there, but that's because this is the tail, and when I weave that in, it'll disappear. And you get your seam allowance on the other side, so this little ridge. Very, very strong seam. Now, similarly, if you were needing to sew stitches to rows, just get that out of the way. So let's say I needed to sew a cast on or bind off row to a cast on or bind off edge to a row edge, then it'd be similar. I just have to adjust my rate of it. So the seam I just did of stitches to stitches would be something like a shoulder seam, where the front and the back meet each other at the shoulder. Do a little figure 8 here. I'm making a very wacky shape, but that's okay. We're just playing. Now I do my figure 8 going upwards when I'm about to seam. When I'm done a seam, at the end I'll do a figure 8 going downwards, which again aligns the edges, makes it nice and neat, and has me ready to weave in my tails. So here on the right side I've got stitches. So I'm going to be catching my V as close as I can get to the edge. This one is a cast on edge, so it looks a little different than what we just did, but it's the last V I can find right before the edge. And then on the left side, these are row ends, so here I'm going to catch my bar. Now the trick to this is you're definitely not going to get 1 to 1, because knitted stitches aren't square. So if you have a 4-inch seam, you're going to have more rows than you have stitches along that 4 inches. And you know that when you look at a knitted gauge, if you have 20 stitches, you've always got more rows. So sometimes on the row edge here, you're going to need to catch 2 bars. And the best thing to do is to kind of clip your pieces together with stitch markers or coilless safety pins, or even just tying little snips of yarn, so that you can see that every inch or 2 you're lining things up, and then the next inch or 2 is clipped together so you can line it up, and eventually you'll kind of know how often you need to catch 2. And this one also, it's a little less invisible because of the direction change, but again, when you pull it tight enough, you just don't see that seam even though it's in a very different color yarn. Normally I do sew seams with the same yarn as in the project, but sometimes I don't if the yarn in the project is very delicate and won't hold up to that yanking that we have to do, or if it's very thick, or if it's even thick and thin, or kind of boucle or another texture. Then I find a yarn that is strong and smooth, similar in color, if anything a little darker, and definitely the same washability. You don't want to take a machine wash pieces and sew them together with a hand wash only yarn, because then you have a hand wash only project. You can see even down the road where there's some stress, if this is the kind of seam you get at the top of a inset sleeve, you still don't see that different color showing, so the color doesn't matter quite as much.